感谢今天给我们打赏的观众啊，感谢 Donna Frank， 感谢如是我闻，感谢这个麦团，感谢甜点，感谢各位的支持。那么接下来呢是这个华尔街联报，最近啊这个美国驻中国的大使伯恩斯啊又坐着高铁呢到处去了。那最新根据他的这个推文显示呢，伯恩斯大使是坐着高铁去了湖南衡阳。那么在高铁上呢，他又展示了他最近在读的画册，那么是和二战相关。那么我们在华尔街联报中也收录了这位伯恩斯大使的最新的一份详谈。那么此外呢，还有学者抱怨呢，说这个习近平在台上的时候呢是没法做中国研究的。那这又是怎么回事呢？这些呢都在华尔街联报，所以不要错过。那么我们在明天的华尔街论坛再和大家见面了，不见不散。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的6度解析节目。在这里，我们将深入探讨一个充满挑战的课题：西方学者在中国研究中所面临的重重困难。随着习近平不断加强政治控制，这些学者的研究工作正遭遇空前的阻碍，尤其是在数据获取和信息交流方面。许多学者不得不重新学习毛泽东时代的研究方法，这反映了他们在当前环境下的无奈与适应。在这种情况下，西方国家的反华情绪日益高涨，进一步加剧了困境。研究者们不仅难以获得资金支持，还面临个人安全的威胁。随着疫情逐渐缓解，虽然一些学者试图重返中国，但他们却发现，无论是面对面访谈还是档案研究都变得更加困难。我们将揭示这一切背后的深层原因，并探讨这对学术界以及国际关系的潜在影响。请大家继续收看详细内容。大家好，欢迎来到6度解析。今天我们将深入探讨一个影响全球学术界的重要话题：中国在习近平领导下强化政治控制，如何阻碍外国学者的研究工作，并导致学者们重拾毛泽东时代的研究方法。这篇文章来自《华尔街日报》，作者是Chan Han Wang，发表于2024年9月9日。首先，让我们来看一下文章的详细内容。在全球事务中，中国的影响力日益增强，而西方学者在研究这个快速崛起的超级大国时，却面临越来越多的限制。这些限制主要来自中国政府，但也有一部分来自他们所在的西方国家。习近平上台以来，中国不断强化政治控制，获取信息的渠道变得更加困难。曾经公开的研究课题被压制，中外人士的互动受到严密监控，阻碍了思想交流。这些障碍迫使一些学者改变研究领域，或者重拾毛泽东时代发展起来的研究方法。当时中国与世界基本隔绝，学者们只能通过分析党内文件、官方媒体报道等方式进行研究。此外，美国和其他西方国家的反华情绪急剧升温，令局面更加复杂。一些学者担心，因为与中国有关联而受到诋毁，研究资金也变得越来越难获得。普林斯顿大学的 Rory Truax 指出，美国对中国的了解远不及中国对美国的了解。在研究中国的过程中，学者们发现面对面采访和档案研究变得更加困难。例如，纽约市立大学的副教授 K. Lee 表示，他以前能与当地法官直接对话，现在几乎不可能实现。对年轻学者来说，挑战更为巨大，因为他们缺乏深厚的本地人脉网络。一些中国研究人员已停止与外国同行共享数据，以避免违反数据安全法，使合作和同行评审过程复杂化。这种情况导致一些学者彻底改变研究领域，例如加州大学尔湾分校的包爱梅，他放弃了研究中国传统算命习俗，转而研究针灸在美国的现状。还有一些学者因为政治敏感性，发现很难与本地调查公司合作，调查成本飙升到令人望而却步的程度。与此同时，特朗普政府叫停了对富布赖特对华学术交流项目的资助，增加了学者们的困难。普林斯顿大学的研究数据显示，美国国家科学基金会资助的中国相关研究项目数量大幅下降。这些挑战导致西方学术界对中国的研究成果质量受损。越来越多的投稿依赖数据驱动的定量分析，而不是民族志研究。伦敦政治经济学院的副教授 Timothy Hildebrandt 表示，对数据的依赖催生了有时不一定有趣或重要的研究。 一些学者转向现代技术或重拾毛泽东时代的研究方法，例如文本分析。宾夕法尼亚州布林茅尔学院的助理教授 Lauren Restrepo 依靠卫星图像、政府文件、新闻和社交媒体进行研究。虽然这种方法有其局限性，但对于那些无法返回中国的学者来说，已经是无奈之举。然而，对于那些经验丰富且拥有深入本地人脉的学者来说，避开敏感话题仍可以在中国进行有用的实地考察。哈佛大学的历史学家宋一鸣指出，美国学生赴华留学人数急剧下降，且疫情后没有明显反弹，这对中国问题研究的长远未来提出了担忧。他认为，无论中国未来是美国的敌人、竞争对手还是朋友，美国应当对中国有更多的了解。现在让我们从不同角度分析这个问题。首先，从政治角度来看，习近平的政治控制强化无疑是为了巩固党的权威和国家稳定。然而，这种高压政策对国际交流和学术研究产生了负面影响，削弱了中外学者之间的合作。这种状态不仅使西方国家对中国的了解受限，也让中国逐渐失去国际学术界的信任。从学术角度来看，研究中国的学者面临的困境不仅体现在获取信息的困难上，还反映在研究方法的局限性上。依赖文本分析和数据驱动的研究方法虽然可以弥补实地考察的不足，但这种方法在捕捉社会动态和人文细节方面存在局限。此外，学术研究资金的减少进一步限制了学者们的研究能力。从社会角度来看，西方国家的反华情绪和政策加剧了学者们的困境。学者们不仅要面对来自中国的限制，还要应对自己国家内部的质疑和资金短缺。这种双重压力使得一些学者不得不改变研究领域，或者放弃原本计划的研究。从长远来看，这种状况对中美关系和全球学术界都是不利的。缺乏对中国的深入了解，西方国家在应对中国崛起时可能会做出不明智的决策。对于中国来说，限制外国学者的研究不仅会导致国际社会对中国的误解增加，还可能使中国在全球学术界的地位下降。综上所述，习近平不断强化的政治控制对外国学者研究中国造成了严重阻碍。学者们被迫重拾毛泽东时代的研究方法，或转向不太敏感的研究领域。这种情况不仅影响了学术研究的质量和深度，还对中美关系和全球学术界产生了广泛的负面影响。我们希望未来能看到更多的交流和理解，而不是限制和对抗。欢迎大家进入六度探索的辩论环节。我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
研究中国越来越难，这不是挑战，而是机遇。就像《孙子兵法》里说的，知己知彼，百战不殆。现在我们有机会以更加创新的方式了解中国，不再依赖传统方法。毛泽东时代的研究方法其实蕴含着智慧，是一种回归初心的探索。
哦，楚天舒，我们现在不是在玩古代战略游戏，这些障碍让研究变得繁琐至极。你说这是机遇，但对于那些需要面对面采访和实地调查的学者来说，这简直是噩梦。天空中飞过一只乌鸦，它都在想办法逃离这个令人窒息的环境。
谢琪琪，你这乌鸦可真有趣。然而，别忘了，历史上的大多数伟大发现都是在最困难的时候取得的。哥白尼提出日心说时，也面临重重障碍。如今，利用新技术如遥感和文本分析，可以在不受限的情况下获取丰富的数据。再说了，美国和西方国家自身的反华情绪也不是中国能控制的，对吧？
天舒，你的乐观真是让人惊叹。但我们不是在写科幻小说，现实问题需要现实解决。你提到遥感和文本分析，像是用显微镜去找银河系。再说，反华情绪的升温也是因为信息不透明。我们需要的是交流和理解，而不是猜谜游戏。
好吧，琪琪，要是我们都像你这么消极，那当年阿波罗11号就永远不会登月了。事实上，正是因为有了这些新的挑战，才激发了学者们的创新。看看普林斯顿大学和约翰霍普金斯大学，他们正在重新定义研究方法， 培养出更有创造力的学者。这种转变长远来看，对双方都有利。
天叔，你真的是阿波罗登月的忠实粉丝啊！但别忘了，登月是靠团队合作和透明的交流实现的。如今的研究环境像是一片迷雾，学者们像无头苍蝇般乱撞。你说的那些创新方法只是权宜之计，我们需要的是开放和合作，否则学术研究的未来就像那片永远无法到达的月亮。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的突发事件节目。今天我们将深入探讨苹果在 iPhone 16发布会上揭示的一切惊喜和新功能。这次活动不仅推出了全新的 iPhone 16系列，更有全新设计的 Apple Watch 和 AirPods， 甚至还透露了 iOS 18的未来变化。iPhone 16和 iPhone 16 Plus 的发布引发了大家的热烈讨论。这两款新手机不仅拥有防水防尘的设计，还增添了如超蓝、蓝绿和粉红等新色彩。这次的 Action 按钮也让人耳目一新，还有一个全新的相机控制功能，让用户能够快速轻松地掌控拍摄。此外 ，iPhone 16系列搭载了强大的 A18 芯片，为即将到来的 Apple Intelligence 功能提供了强大支持。还有 AirPods 4的到来让人期待，这款耳机不仅形状改进，更引入了主动噪音取消和透明模式的选择。Apple Watch 系列时也不甘示弱，展示了更大的显示屏和新的健康功能，包括睡眠呼吸暂停检测，这将在超过150个国家推出。但这一切还不止于此，还有更多的惊喜等着大家去探索，包括 AirPods Max 的新颜色和 AirPods Pro 的听力保护功能。这一切都在苹果的全新产品中等待着你去发现，请大家继续收看详细内容。欢迎收看突发事件特别节目，我是您的主持人。今天我们要探讨的是苹果公司最新的产品发布会，这是每年9月科技界的重磅事件。文章来源于科技资讯网站 Engadget 和 The Verge， 详细报道了苹果在库比蒂诺举行的发布会内容。现在让我们深入了解一下此次发布会的主要内容和背后的深层意义。首先，我们来看看备受关注的 iPhone 16系列。苹果此次发布了 iPhone 16和 iPhone 16 Plus。这两款新机型不仅在外观设计上有所突破，具备防水防尘功能，还推出了多种新颜色选择，包括超海蓝、青绿色和粉色。iPhone 16配备了 6.1 英寸的显示屏，而 iPhone 16 Plus 则为 6.7 英寸。这两款屏幕的亮度最高可达2000尼特，在黑暗环境中最低可以降至1尼特。一个显著的新功能是动作按钮，这是一种高度可定制的按钮，首次在去年的 Pro 型号中引入，现在也被应用到标准型号中。相机功能方面 ，iPhone 16系列也有了明显的升级。新增加的快速访问相机控制按钮允许用户通过滑动手指快速启动和控制相机。此外，还引入了名为视觉智能的 AI 功能，它可以分析摄像头所指向的物体，比如自动将活动日期添加到你的日历。相机阵列包括一个 48MP 主摄像头，一个 12MP 长焦镜头和一个全新带有自动对焦功能的超广角镜头。这些相机还能捕捉 Spatial Photos， 可以在苹果的 Vision Pro 设备上观看。在内部配置上 ，iPhone 16系列搭载了新的 A18 芯片，具有一个16核神经引擎，优化了生成模型。CPU 为6核 ，GPU 为5核，这些硬件将为即将推出的 iOS 18中的各种智能功能提供强大的支持。接下来是 AirPods 4的发布。这款新耳机的设计进行了调整，以更好地适应不同耳型，并提高佩戴舒适度。其内置 H2 芯片，提供更高质量的音频体验，还支持个性化空间音频。充电盒采用 USB-C 接口，并且是迄今为止最小的 AirPods 充电盒。除了常规款，还有支持主动降噪和透明模式的版本，并且加入了绘画感知功能。当检测到用户在与他人交谈时，会自动降低媒体音量。苹果还推出了新的 AirPods Max 颜色选择，并增加了 USB-C 充电接口。 虽然 AirPods Pro 并没有全新版本发布，但增加了一些新的听力保护功能，比如听力保护和听力测试功能，用户可以通过这项功能检测并预防听力损失。再来看 Apple Watch， 此次发布的 Apple Watch Series 10无疑是一个亮点。它拥有更大更薄的显示屏和更宽的屏幕比例，外形设计更加圆润。屏幕亮度在特定角度下提高了 40%， 并且在手腕休息时也能显示秒针。Series 10搭载了新的 S10 chip 芯片，苹果声称这款芯片在性能、能效和智能方面都有显著提升。苹果的智能功能在新款 Apple Watch 中得到了充分体现，比如新的照片表盘功能可以自动从用户的照片库中挑选最佳照片。健康功能方面 ，Series 10能够检测睡眠呼吸暂停，这项功能目前在等待 FDA 批准，预计将在150多个国家推出。此外，还增加了新的潜水追踪功能和 Tides 应用支持。对于 Apple Watch Ultra 2，虽然没有推出第3代产品，但增加了新的缎黑色饰面，同时还推出了一些新的 Hermes 饰面和 Milanese 表带。从不同角度来看，苹果此次发布会有几个显著的亮点和趋势。首先是硬件和软件的深度融合。新的 A18 芯片和 iOS 18中的 AI 功能展示了苹果在计算能力和智能应用上的领先地位。其次，苹果正在进一步细化和个性化其设备功能，不论是通过 AirPods 的个性化空间音频，还是 Apple Watch 的健康监测功能，都显示出苹果对用户体验的深层关注。苹果在生态系统的构建上也走得更远，各个设备之间的协同效应愈发明显。这种生态系统不仅锁定了用户，还能提供无缝的使用体验。然而，也要看到一些潜在问题。首先是价格问题，新产品的高昂价格可能会阻碍部分消费者的购买意愿，尤其是在全球经济不确定的情况下。其次，苹果在隐私和数据安全方面的承诺能否得到充分的履行，仍然是用户关注的焦点。总体而言，苹果的这次发布会再次证明了其在科技创新领域的领导地位。不论是硬件设计上的突破，还是软件功能的创新，苹果都在不断引领行业潮流。未来，我们期待这些新产品和功能如何在实际使用中真正提升用户体验，也期待苹果继续在科技领域创造更多的奇迹。此外，这次发布会的重头戏则是 iPhone 16 Pro 系列。根据苹果官方在发布会上分享的信息，新款旗舰手机的屏幕尺寸比之前的型号有所增加 ，iPhone 16 Pro 为 6.3 英寸 ，iPhone 16 Pro Max 为 6.9 英寸，相比上一代的 6.1 英寸和 6.7 英寸更大。手机机身依旧由钛金属制成，颜色包括黑色、白色、自然色和新推出的沙漠钛色。苹果还声称 iPhone 16 Pro Max 拥有有史以来最长的电池续航时间。iPhone 16 Pro 系列搭载了 A18 Pro 芯片，内含16核神经引擎，相较于 iPhone 15 Pro， 其性能提升了 15%。此外，得益于6核 GPU， 图形处理性能提高了 20%。在相机方面 ，iPhone 16 Pro 配备了4800万像素的融合相机、4800万像素的超广角相机以及1200万像素的5倍长焦相机。其中 ，iPhone 16 Pro 也采用了此前 iPhone 15 Pro Max 独有的4棱镜设计。新系列还新增了相机控制按钮，并将在后续的软件更新中获得双段快门功能。苹果此次发布的 iPhone 16系列重点突出了与 AI 相关的功能，特别是在 Apple Intelligence 方面，部分功能将于10月推出测试版。与其他科技公司类似 ，AI 成为苹果今年的重点之一。感谢收看本期突发事件，我是您的主持人，我们下期再见。
I have to start with something in the news. The U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York has charged one of Governor Kathy Hochul's aides with acting as an illegal agent for the Chinese government. If that is true, what are the diplomatic consequences that might emerge?
Robbie, this is, as you know, a law enforcement matter and a matter for the Justice Department and the U.S. Attorney, so it would not be proper for me to comment, so I really have nothing to say on the matter and would refer you to the U.S. Attorney's office.
I understand that, but clearly there will be some diplomatic repercussions. There were rumors in New York that China's consul general in New York was expelled. That was then walked back, but we will, of course, see how that develops. I want to get to some bigger picture topics in a bit, but one other question on recent news. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was in Beijing last week, and our audience has read and studied the official readouts, so I won't make you repeat them, but what I would like is to get your personal sense of how the meetings went and what that tells you about the state of the U.S.-China relationship.
Well, Jake Sullivan had a very productive trip and I think very constructive trip here to Beijing last week. He had 12 hours of meetings with Director of the Foreign Affairs Commission and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. He met for the first time the Vice Chair of the Central Military Commission, General Zhang Yuxia, and we had never met him before in his current position. And of course, most importantly, Jake and I and others were able to meet with President Xi Jinping last week for another important meeting. This is a channel that we have had since 2021. Jake has had 9 meetings now, either with Wang Yi or with his predecessor, Yang Jieshi. And if you combine that with a very good channel that Secretary Tony Blinken has had with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and Secretary Blinken saw President Xi when he was here in April, and you add to that what Secretary Janet Yellen of the Treasury Department has done, Secretary Gina Raimondo has done, we now have connectivity with the Chinese leadership. And that might sound ordinary to some of the people watching this podcast, but it's actually quite extraordinary, and it's actually quite important. As recently as February 2023, in the wake of the balloon incident, we were really at rock bottom in this relationship. We did not have reliable cabinet-level channels. We sought to create them in 2023 and again in this year, and I think we've succeeded. It does not mean that we have resolved by any means the vast number of disagreements we have and the competition we have between the U.S. and the People's Republic of China, but it does mean that we're connected diplomatically, that we can talk through some of these problems, and we can avoid conflict while defending our national interest. I think that's a very, very important goal for this relationship. If you assume, the way that I do, that this is a structural competition, structural in military, economic, technology realms, and it will remain structural, and I think intensely competitive well into the next decade. So we have to manage this relationship in such a way that we defend American national interests, but we avoid a conflict at the same time. President Biden feels very strongly about that, and I know that Jake Sullivan was very much in that frame of mind when he was here last week.
That's very encouraging to hear, and there's little doubt that the last 18 months have been so much more positive in terms of the connections you're describing. But that said, there have been some worrying flare-ups in the South China Sea and other hotspots. Can you give us a sense of how some of these connections work in moments like that?
Well, to take the South China Sea, for instance, and the U.S. treaty commitment to the Philippines, we've seen a series of very unfortunate and very ill-advised efforts by the government of China to intimidate the Philippines at Second Thomas Shoal, at Sabina Shoal, in an incident at Scarborough Shoal, just to name 3 incidents over the last month or so. And we've used our diplomatic channels. Certainly, I have done so as ambassador here. Secretary Blinken did when he was here a couple of months ago, and Jake Sullivan did last week, to tell the Chinese leadership very directly, we have an ironclad commitment to defend the Philippines under Article 4 of our 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty. And it's very important to be able to say that and to be able to talk through this issue and to encourage directly the Chinese leadership to try to resolve these disagreements with the Philippines peacefully and through diplomacy, and not through Chinese ships ramming or water cannoning Filipino ships. And so it really is important that we have these direct conversations on an issue like that.
And of course, the relationship with the Philippines is so much more clear-cut. But then you have Taiwan, and given everything you've been saying in this conversation, it just strikes me that when former Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, it really set U.S.-China relations back. What happens when there's a new administration and you have other high-level delegations clamoring to visit Taiwan?
Well, you know, we've had a remarkable consistency here in the United States on our Taiwan policy ever since President Nixon's trip to China in 1972 and in all the subsequent administrations. We've held every administration to a one China policy. And we've made sure that we've been consistent across all those decades in what we've said to the Chinese leadership. And obviously, it's in a way, it's been very successful because despite all of the inflammatory rhetoric and some of the inflammatory actions, since Speaker Pelosi, for instance, since her visit here just over 2 years ago, we've seen a marked increase in Chinese naval and air activity in the Taiwan Strait. Despite all that, the Taiwan Strait has remained peaceful since the early 1970s. And so we think the One China policy is working, and we are resolutely committed to it. And the Chinese leadership knows that. Jake Sullivan's trip here last week, Secretary Blinken's trip, all the meetings that I have, we're able to make clear to the Chinese what we think should happen in terms of restraint and adherence to the status quo, and our insistence that there be a peaceful resolution of the cross-strait differences.
I want to ask you about fentanyl and the context in which that came up last week in all of the high-level meetings. This is, of course, a killer that is affecting regular Americans in all kinds of unexpected and also heartbreaking ways. And what I want to understand is, why is it so hard for Beijing to completely stop the flow of precursor elements to the United States?
Well, this is a major issue for us. President Biden raised it directly with President Xi at the San Francisco summit last November. We've had innumerable discussions, and the basic problem is that a great percentage, a majority of the precursor chemicals that the drug cartels in Mexico use to fabricate the synthetic opioid fentanyl, they come from China. Now, I think it's important to say, and to be fair to the government here, they don't come from the Chinese government. They come from illicit Chinese firms. And so we have begun an effort last November, and we've made some progress with the Chinese government here to make sure that they're beginning to shut down the flow of these precursor chemicals. So just several weeks ago, the government of China listed 3 precursor chemicals now prohibited for export from China to Central America and to Mexico, or for anywhere else in the world for that matter. We've begun as a part of this effort to have, I think, much broader and more successful law enforcement cooperation on the fentanyl issue from the Drug Enforcement Agency, which is doing, I think, a really fine job in connecting with the Chinese on this, with the Department of Homeland Security, and specifically Secretary Ali Mayorkas, who has formed a relationship with the Minister of Public Security, Wang Xiaohong, and they've been able to work through some of these problems. So we're by no means at the end of this process, rather we're at the beginning, but I'm encouraged by some of the progress. We want to see more actions, specific actions by the government of China on the precursor chemical issue. We want to see arrests, obviously, and we also want to see attention to illicit finance, because part of the problem here is shadowy finance networks, criminal networks that fund these sales and that fund the drug cartels as well. It's a top flight issue for us, Ravi. As you know, fentanyl is the leading cause of death in America, of Americans 18 to 45. And so we feel an absolute responsibility and commitment to keep this at the forefront of the U.S.-China relationship. And that's something that I do here and that my team does here at the American Embassy.
That's good to hear. So, Ambassador, I want to take a bit of a step back. You've been a diplomat since the 1980s, and when you started off, there was a big push to get China to open up to the world. There was a general belief that this would help American companies and also the global economy. And in the last few years, particularly since 2018, the consensus has shifted dramatically in Washington. There's a bipartisan belief now that China is more of a challenge than an opportunity, and many people see it plainly as a threat. So here's what I want to ask you. As someone who's been in government, in public service for both of these eras, the ear that wanted more partnership with China and the one that wants to constrain it. How do you explain this immense policy shift?
Well, I think that policy shift, and you're right to ask the question, it's a central question. That policy shift has been, I think, motivated by changing circumstances and changing policies here in China. I first came to China in 1988 as a young American diplomat, accompanying our then Secretary of State, George Shultz. I came back in 1989 with President George H.W. Bush and have been here, consistently since. In China in the late 1980s and the early 1990s was a different country. It was, in a way, more open to the rest of the world. It wasn't clear back then that China was going to be so aggressive towards its neighbors in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, or even in the Taiwan Strait. Deng Xiaoping's policy in the 80s was very different on that issue. You remember, hide your light and bide your time. But China changed. And we've seen a more aggressive China in this region. We've seen a China that in economic terms, through forced technology transfer, through intellectual property theft, not at all creating a level playing field for American companies. And I see that here. It's a very different China. So administrations have had to react to that change. And we have a much more competitive framework. And I very much agree with that competitive framework, and that's a basis of our policy. We're competing in the security realm with China in the Indo-Pacific, and that's an intense competition. We're competing technologically. If you think about developments in artificial intelligence and biotechnology and quantum mathematics, we have a range of problems on the economic front. Right, as I talked to you today, our Undersecretary of Commerce, Marisa Lago, is here, and she and I were addressing some of these issues with the Chinese just yesterday. And of course, we have long-standing, abiding commitments to defend human rights here and to be critical when we have to be of what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, the lack of religious freedom. So this is a very challenging relationship. And I feel that as we practice diplomacy with our Chinese counterparts here in Beijing and around this country. And I think that is, in many ways, the centerpiece of this relationship. The challenge is, can we compete and yet avoid the kind of conflict that would be catastrophic for the world? That's a major responsibility that we feel in the Biden administration. And as we compete, there's one more thing I think I should say, and that is we do want to look for areas of engagement, try to cooperate with China when our interests are aligned and when it's to the benefit of the United States. John Podesta, the president's climate change advisor, is also here this week. And, China's 28% of global emissions. The United States is 10%, but we are the two leading carbon emitters. And so we do want to work with the Chinese to encourage them to meet their Paris commitments from the international agreement. We mentioned fentanyl. It's very much in the interest of the United States not to walk away from this relationship, but to be in the trenches, pushing for progress to stem the flow of those precursor chemicals to the United States. Global public health is a third issue. So this is a largely competitive issue. I spend the great majority of my time on the competitive side, but we do have the engagement side as well. And it's a much more complicated, certainly much less trusting relationship than I think President George H.W. Bush or President Clinton, I served in both of those administrations, had with the Chinese leadership. So I think, American leaders in both parties, this has been bipartisan, have shifted and have had to shift to face this more aggressive China that is contesting American interests in this part of the world and really around the world.
So let me ask you this, in as much as to some extent you're admitting that the H.W. Bush and Clinton administrations maybe made too much of a bet on China going a certain way, and that bet turned out to be wrong. But just as much as that might be the case, there are critics who today worry that U.S. policy has gone too far in the other direction. And, I should caveat, I am no apologist for China. I know it does things that are harmful for the global order and for democracy. But there is a case to be made for how U.S. policy on China today can sometimes be counterproductive. I mean, economists say that trade tariffs hurt Americans more than they help. And even when you have something like Jake Sullivan's small yard, high fence strategy, there's a general critique that national security interests, in other words, what constitutes the yard, is not clearly defined. And so I guess my question is, has the pendulum swung too far in the other direction? Is America being too tough on China?
I don't think so. I think we're facing the reality. And, as diplomats, you have to face reality. You have to recognize it, and you have to defend your country's national interest. Here we have in the People's Republic of China a government that is far too aggressive against American allies in the South China Sea, that's the Philippines, against Japan in the Senkaku Islands of the East China Sea, that has been far too belligerent and reliant on military intimidation of Taiwan, especially since Speaker Pelosi's visit, a government that is embarked on a major historic modernization of the People's Liberation Army in a way that's very much against the interests of the United States, a China that is increasing dramatically its nuclear weapon stockpile and yet refusing to talk to the rest of the world, no transparency about this, a China that is using the organs of its state power, whether it's intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, I mentioned them both before, but also cyber, in order to give advantage to its own companies, and yet in a very unfair way, diminish the prospects for fair trade and fair investment. I could go on and on. There are lots of other issues to talk about, but we have to face the reality. China is a major competitor of the United States. Our advantage here is that we have a group of like-minded allies that see the same competition and the same threat. If you think about our alliance with Japan, with the Republic of Korea, with Thailand, with the Philippines, with Australia, the development of AUKUS, and of course the emergence of the Quad that includes India, Japan, Australia, and the United States as a real force, a diplomatic and economic force and strategic force in this region. We have to respond to the challenge that China is posing and to the illiberal policies that it's advocating for the future of the United Nations and the future of the global liberal order that we prize and that we helped to create in the wake of the Second World War. This is a very serious challenge to American interests, and we've had no recourse but to meet that challenge. At the same time, I do want to accentuate here, Ravi, we also want to use diplomacy as the main instrument in engaging the Chinese. Now, we obviously have sanctioned China in many respects. We've sanctioned most recently the Chinese leadership for its very ill-advised support for Russia in the Ukraine war, its political and diplomatic support. Thousands of Chinese companies providing very important dual-use technology to the Russian defense industrial base that allows Russia to conduct these absolutely abhorrent attacks on civilians in Ukraine. So we're dealing with a major challenge here. I do think we have the right policy. I'm a diplomat, so I also believe that while two governments contest and compete, we have to keep the people of the country meeting. And this is an issue that hasn't received a lot of attention, but because of the pandemic, and particularly because of the Chinese government policy of zero COVID, the lockdowns, the closing off of the country, the inability of people to travel here, we're in a situation where we've had one congressional delegation visit China in the last 5 years. Until Secretary Blinken and Secretary Yellen visited here in mid-2023, we hadn't had a Secretary of State or Treasury here in 4 years. We've only had one governor of any American state, that was Governor Gavin Newsom, visit here, and he visited last year. And what I really worry about is a dramatic reduction of American students here from 15,000 10 years ago to only about 800 now. A dramatic reduction in two-way tourism. Flights between the two countries are at best right now 1/4 of what they were pre-pandemic. In a situation like this, you don't want to see a decoupling of two societies. It's very important to keep the people of the United States and China working together as the two governments contest a very difficult relationship. So I think that aspect, we call it people to people, is very important.
I couldn't agree with you more on the people to people, and we will come to that a bit later in this conversation. But one of the things that makes it harder to maintain the people to people ties is when there is this sort of hawkish mood in DC, which then has a ripple effect across a range of other sectors. But since you brought up alliances, Ambassador, I wanted to bring this other question up of America's role and sort of the standing it has to criticize China. I channel a lot of countries in the global south when I say that there are fears that for all that much of the world will agree with everything you've said about China breaking the rules, whether it is, you know, the law of the sea, whether it's human rights violation, whether it's currency manipulation, IP laws, they're all valid criticisms. But you know, the response both from Beijing and often from other countries is, and not incorrectly, I should add, is that the United States itself doesn't always follow the rules. If you look at how it approaches the courts at the World Trade Organization, or how it approaches decisions by, you know, international courts or the UN when it disagrees with their findings, for example, in the Middle East. I know you can't defend all of this, but when your Chinese interlocutors call out what they see as U.S. hypocrisy, how do you respond?
I reject it. I don't see any equivalence between the actions of China and the actions of the United States. We have been the major supporter of the liberal order that is the backbone and the superstructure of how the world works today. We've been the defender of that system. And the Chinese, of course, engage the government here, the government-controlled press here, which is not a free press, contests the United States every day, and it distorts our positions. And so we're engaged in a battle of ideas, trying to get accurate information about our society and about our government, about our alliances into the bloodstream here and into the cyber universe here, to all the hundreds of millions, if not more than 1 billion people in China on social media. So that's an important part of this. But I certainly do not see, or nor do I accept, any equivalence. The United States has never claimed, any of our presidents, that we're a perfect country and we're transparent. And we often will admit our mistakes when we make them. And both our president and secretary of state have been clear about that. I've said that in fora here. But we stand for democracy. We stand for the right things in the world. And if you take our Indo-Pacific alliances and also the NATO alliance and our close strategic partnership with the US and EU, we have countries that see China in the same way and that are insisting that China live up to, let's say, international standards on human rights. We're not alone in this fight. When it comes to the global south, we've also been very clear because we have strong relationships in Central and South America and Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, in South Asia. We're not asking countries to choose between a relationship with the United States and a relationship with China. We know for many of these countries, their economic and trade relationship is probably larger for many of them with China, but we are asking them to keep an open mind and an open door about the US. So this is a fair competition, if you will, but it's not a binary one where you're with us or against us. The world doesn't work that way anymore. And I think that message, and particularly Secretary Blinken, has been showcasing that message in his travels around the world. I think it's a very effective message. And I know here, I'm very close and friendly with a lot of the ambassadors from all these countries here. We talk about these issues all the time. So I think the United States, what we offer to the world, stands up on its own. I don't apologize for it. And I try to give people an accurate portrayal of American society and policy because it's under assault from the state-controlled press here that is not telling the truth here in China about the nature of American society or our government.
I agree with you with the press. There's no doubt about that. And I do wish the Chinese government allowed more of a free press and allowed us to send our reporters there. We don't have anyone there. But, you know, it's not always a black and white thing. I think what I was getting at in my question is that over the last 20 years or so, there has been a decline in US soft power perceptually around the world. Some of that has to do with the way in which the war in Iraq turned out. Some of it has to do with the way in which the war on terror and in Afghanistan turned out. And you could make the case that China and other countries have taken advantage of that to try and, you know, portray the United States as a country that says one thing and does another, that talks about a rules-based liberal international order, but often bypasses some of those rules when convenient. That's the criticism I hear from ambassadors and diplomats around the world, who sometimes do feel like they are being made to choose between the United States and China and resent that.
Ravi, it's, you know, when the United States makes mistakes, we normally own up to those mistakes. There's a degree of transparency in our democracy. We're an open book in our democracy that is certainly not present in Russia or China or Iran or Venezuela or North Korea, just to name a couple of countries that are authoritarian. And so I think that transparency helps us. In terms of our image and American soft power, if you go to sub-Saharan Africa and ask people about what George W. Bush, who initiated the PEPFAR program, and Barack Obama did, billions of dollars spent to save millions of lives, that's a powerful part of American soft power. I'll give you another example that as I travel in Asia, but also particularly travel throughout China, there's a lot of respect for American science and technology, for the innovative part of our economy, which is a big part of it, for the success we've had in becoming the world leader, for instance, in artificial intelligence. So I don't think America is losing this, but there is a contest for soft power, if you will, and that's a fair contest. My job is to be open. It's to tell the truth about American society, and is to combat the lies and misinformation that some of the authoritarian countries spew on a daily basis about the United States. This is a fair battle, and we put a lot of effort into this battle. We're not so much on criticizing other countries as we are defending American values and portraying a true picture of American society and of our government's actions.
Mm. So I promised to take some subscriber questions, and we've gotten so many from around the world. One recurring question is, what do you see as the end state of US-China competition?
You know, I think it's clear, as I said before, Ravi, that an essential truth about the US-China relationship, it's going to be competitive for years to come, I think well into the next decade of the 2030s. And so we have to pursue that competition. But in doing so, if you talk about an end state, we want a peaceful relationship between these two very strong countries with arguably the two strongest militaries of the world. You see that in what President Biden says when he talks about this relationship, when Secretary Blinken, when Jake Sullivan was here last week, he said, our job is to compete, but to do so in a way that's responsible and to manage these differences through intensive diplomacy. And that's my job here on a daily basis, so that while we compete and defend these very important interests to which we're attached, we want to see our allies respected in the South and East China Sea. We want to see human rights respected. We're not going to cease and desist in pursuing those interests, but at the same time, we have to keep the peace between these two strongest countries in the world. So that's a major part of what we're doing. End state, you know, history never really ends. It's a continuum, but talking about an end state is to stand up for our values, stand up for our interests, compete responsibly, and yet make sure that there's enough connectivity between us that we drive down the probability of a military conflict. Speaking of that, one of the things we've been pursuing is a closer military-to-military channel. In the wake of the balloon incident, even during the balloon incident, the Chinese refused to talk to our senior military leadership, but now we've made some progress. I think that Admiral Sam Paparo who is the Indo-Pacific commander of American forces in this part of the world, is going to have a conversation with a Southern Theater commander of the People's Liberation Army in the next few weeks. We very much hope that will continue at even more senior levels. Secretary Austin, his counterpart, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Brown and his counterpart. We've got to have that connectivity so that if there is an accident or a misunderstanding, our military leaders can meet to lower the temperature, divide any parties that have collided or are arguing, and make sure that we have a rational way to resolve problems. That's very important on the military side. Another example, AI obviously has enormous promise for human society, but there are major risks, particularly given the military risks associated with AI. We've had one conversation with the Chinese leadership in Geneva a couple of months ago. We hope to work to be able to have a second conversation and continue a dialogue that has to happen with all the countries in the world, but particularly between the US and China. How do we manage these risks responsibly so that AI does not increase the probability of conflict? These are ground truth issues that are vital for the national security of both of our countries. And that's why we have to engage diplomatically consistently every day. And that's my main job here and the great team that I have here in China at our embassy in Beijing and at our consulates in Wuhan and Shenyang, Guangzhou, and Shanghai.
So on the end state question, and this is a live debate here in the United States. So Matt Pottinger, who worked on China policy in the Trump administration, he says that the United States should not manage competition, it should win it. And he defines winning as, and I'll quote him here, this is from an essay in Foreign Affairs, he says, China's communist rulers would give up trying to prevail in a hot or cold conflict with the United States and its friends. Sounds like a very different description of competition than what you just laid out.
I have a lot of respect for Matt Pottinger and for Mike Gallagher, former Congressman Gallagher, who is his co-author on that foreign affairs piece. I read it carefully twice. Two points I'd make in response. One, there's an insinuation, maybe even more direct than that, in the article that somehow we're running a feckless détente-like policy, more reminiscent of the 1970s than the 2020s. We're running, as I've just described in this interview, a very tough-minded policy based on defending American national interest and accentuating and building America's military and diplomatic strength in the Indo-Pacific. And I think a fair assessment of President Biden's policy is that we've been very successful in this region, that our alliances are stronger because of what we've done with the Japanese, with the Republic of Korea, with the Philippines, with Australia over the last 3.5 years. I think what often is not mentioned is the success we've had in working with the European Union and NATO to focus them on the problems of both Taiwan, the Chinese activities in the Taiwan Strait, as well as an aggressive China in this region. The fact that we're all working for the same purpose is a very, very important strengthening of our policy. Second, I think we'll do best in U.S.-China policy if our allies support us. And all of those treaty allies of the United States have important trading relationships with the People's Republic of China, as do we. China's our third largest trade partner after Mexico and Canada. So if the suggestion is that somehow we have an outright competition and that we decouple the two economies, I don't think that policy would be successful. I think it would harm American economic and strategic interest. What we're doing is to strengthen deterrence. And that means we enhance the ability to keep the peace out here in a situation like the Taiwan Straits or the Senkaku Islands, in building up American military power so that it's very much respected, as I think it is, by the government here. And I think that and relying on our allies is a much more successful policy in the future for the United States. And I think there are a lot of people in Washington who would agree with that articulation, my articulation of the policy.
So let me ask you a question about the Biden administration's China policy, and that's on export controls. Are the restrictions on things like semiconductors, how much are they hurting the Chinese? And, in conversations with them, do they bring that up with you? How do they react to that?
I'm smiling because they bring it up in every meeting with me and with all the visitors that we have here. This is a very important decision that President Biden made. We are not going to allow the export of highly sensitive, dual-use American technology like advanced semiconductors, because we know if we allow the export of those American products, they'll give an advantage to the People's Liberation Army and to others in the Chinese government, and we cannot allow that to happen. That is straightforward. We've been clear about it. And from October 2022, when we first announced this, we've actually enhanced those restrictions. The president's executive order on artificial intelligence from just over a year ago is another example of that. What's interesting about the Chinese complaints here in Beijing is that they're doing the same thing, but they're just not talking about it. China embarked in 2015 on a strategy to dominate these critical industries. It was called Made in China 2025. And China does not allow its sophisticated technologies to be exported to the United States or to Japan or to Korea or to Western Europe. And so this is a fair competition. We obviously have the right policy here. We're de-risking. It's a small percentage of overall US-China trade, but I think there's large-scale agreement in our society that it would not make any sense to give China the kind of technologies that could allow them to seek to overtake us in military and technological power. At the same time, Secretary Raimondo and I have both said this, Secretary Yellen has said it, we don't want to decouple a major trade relationship because apart from these sensitive technologies, I'll give you the example of healthcare. We're trading in that. American companies are providing essential exports to China. Agriculture is another. Consumer products are two other examples. There are about 750,000 American jobs that depend on trade with China. We're the two largest economies. As Secretary Yellen has said several times, it would be disastrous if we tried to decouple those economies. So it's de-risking on the national security side. It's not ending US-China trade on the other hand.
I want to talk about climate change and cooperation there. And this one's a subscriber question from Wolfgang Pape. And he points to what he identifies as a policy contradiction. So the United States wants to achieve its emissions targets as set out in the Paris Agreement, at least with the Biden administration. And yet the White House is protecting against imports of electronic vehicles from China. How do you justify that?
I don't believe these are mutually exclusive. On the one hand, we're very serious about meeting our commitments under the Paris Agreement. In fact, because of the Inflation Reduction Act and the billions of dollars we're spending on green energy technology, that's going to allow us to meet our international commitments very much in the interest of our own country on climate change, on limiting the average global increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. On the other hand, very important for us to protect our own markets against unfair competition. And, we believe, and many other countries believe, that China is engaged in what economists call overcapacity. The level of subsidies, both from the government in Beijing, but particularly the provincial governments, means that Chinese manufacturers of electric vehicles, of solar panels, of lithium batteries, just to name three of these products, the output, the total output this year and last year exceeds demand here several times over. These products are then being essentially dumped in Turkey, in Western Europe, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Canada, and the United States. And we're simply not going to permit a loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States because of this unfair competition from China. We went through the China shock in the 1990s, in the beginning of this century, and lost millions of American jobs. And President Biden has been clear in levying these tariffs on China, 100% on Chinese EVs, that we're not going to do that again. And it's been interesting, Ravi, to see we're not alone in this. Canada has taken this action. Brazil, Turkey, the European Union have all taken action. And China, I think, has been put on notice. It can't resolve its own economic problems here by exporting unfairly and at artificially low prices these EVs and solar panels to the rest of the world. We have to protect our own markets. Final point on this, and President Biden
just on that, Ambassador, if I may, there's a school of thought that goes that the climate crisis is so urgent and so important to deal with that you take anything you can get. You take the drastic measures, even if that means that one country is unfairly, as you put it, flooding the market with cheaper EVs. But those very EVs could then lead to infrastructure in countries like the United States, which does not have the best infrastructure for, recharging EVs and what have you, and the related markets that go along with that. This would help the fight against climate change.
And the answer to that, and thank you for that point, Ravi, the answer to that, and it was my final point on this issue, is that we don't want a world where all of us around the world are entirely dependent on China for the next 10 to 15 to 20 years for the green technologies that will propel a consistent departure from carbon towards a new economic future. We all have to have the ability, whether it's Japan or Korea or Mexico or the United States, to be producing these products ourselves. So through the Inflation Reduction Act, we're giving our industries a chance and shielding them from unfair Chinese competition so that we can be part of this. And I think one of the fundamental lessons of the pandemic is you don't want to be reliant on a single source of a critical mineral or critical technology, certainly not from a country, the People's Republic of China, that's willing to withhold those technologies for other motives. And they've proven that they can do that. So we stand by this strategy.
So you've been in China for 3 years now. What keeps you up at night? Is it Taiwan? Is it the South China Sea? Is it China's nuclear buildup?
What worries, I worry about a lot of things. I'm paid to worry as a diplomat. I certainly worry about an unintended conflict between our military forces, an accident, an accidental collision. Our navies and air forces are operating in international waters and international airspace in very close proximity in this entire region. And that's why we want to have a commitment from the government of China that should an accident occur, we can have instantaneous communication between our military leaders to reduce the temperature, separate the parties, and resolve the problem. I worry about that. I certainly worry and have great concerns about the aggressive nature of the PLA's military buildup and of the aggressive, intimidating behavior of the PLA Navy when it comes to our ally, the Philippines, or our ally, Japan. Those are important. But on another level, we also have to worry about the future. America needs to be obviously competitive when we think about this major technological shift in quantum mathematics, biotechnology, artificial intelligence. So one of the key aspects of our China policy is to strengthen the American economy and our industrial base at home. We were successful in the Cold War, and I'm old enough that the first 10 years of my career in diplomacy in the State Department were the last 10 years of the old Cold War. We were successful in large part because of our economic and industrial strength. And I think President Biden's very sharp focus, laser-like focus on rebuilding our economy for a 21st century economic model is a key to the China policy. Retaining our military strength and funding our military, particularly our Air Force and Navy here in the Indo-Pacific, is the key to stability and preserving the peace. That's what deterrence is all about. So these are just some of the things that I worry about, but I'm paid to worry out here on point for the US and China.
Last question. You're quite famous for having taken a high-speed rail all over China. What have you seen that has surprised you the most?
We know it's interesting, when you're ambassador to another country, obviously a big part of the job is you are the point of contact between the two governments. But you're also ambassador to the entire country. And so I have made it, especially since the pandemic ended and we could travel again in China and we're not locked down, try to get out and meet the Chinese people. And it's so much easier to do that by rail because, you can walk up and down the aisle, you sit next to somebody. who's Chinese, and you start talking, and you see when I go to Shanghai, for instance, from Beijing, it's 4.5 hours on high-speed rail. You cross the Yellow River, and you cross the Yangtze River. These are the two iconic rivers of Chinese civilization and culture, and it gives you a much deeper appreciation of the people of China itself. And so what I'm trying to do as ambassador is meet the Chinese people, meet provincial party secretaries and governors, meet business people. I shoot baskets with kids on basketball courts. I'm an old person, but I like to shoot baskets. You just try to relate to people, and building an accurate picture of America and projecting an America that wants to live in peace with China through all the difficulties that you and I have talked about. I think that's an important message, that we want our students to come back, that we want the Chinese people, young people, to be studying in our country. And there are well over 290,000 Chinese students in the United States. I think, again, as these our two governments compete, we've got to work to keep people connected. Traveling by train is one minor way to do that, but I enjoy it and I think it's effective.
欢迎来到6度解析，新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的6度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，6度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是6度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的6度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在6度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真